very important in the local church that we understand membership and understand covenant community together. When you arrived at Auburndale 17 years ago or so now, the membership process is probably very different than the way you left it. What was it like when you arrived, and what did you do over the years? Try to bring it to a more healthy place.
So when I went to Auburndale, there were about 30, 40 elderly folks who were in attendance and about 780 members on the membership roll. So a very typical Southern Baptist church that has revitalization need all over it. And because obviously that is not an accurate membership roll. The membership process pretty much didn't exist outside of someone who came forward during this morning service and met the pastor and said, I want to become a member. And they literally just voted right then for whoever was present. And that's actually pretty common, but I would also say pretty unhealthy. So I had a lot I wanted to address. And like a good revitalizer, I was going to wait and take years to do it. But I actually got an opportunity. They asked me how I wanted to take members in the first few months. I said, well, since you're asking, I'd like to be able to know the people, interview them, make sure they actually follow Jesus and, things like that before we actually make them a member. And I'll never forget, an 85-year-old deacon looked at me and said, young man, less than 10 people have joined this church in the last 10 years, and you want to make it harder. And I said, yes, sir. That's at my 29-year-old way. That's what I want to do. And so I'll never forget his face when a year into this, we had more members join in the first year than they had the previous 10. And he recognized it had happened, but he didn't know how to explain it. But that did catapult us in a way that the membership process began to change at that point. How about you? Because you took a church with a lot more people than I did at that time.
Tremendous pride in the number of members that they had, and wanted to see that number printed monthly in the newsletter so they could see it rise. And I think there's a good impulse there. They wanted to reach the community. So, I don't want to disparage their motives completely, but the heart was really to count that number and to take pride in that number. There was a negative aspect to it, an unhealthy aspect to it. But much like you described, receiving members was they would come forward at the end of the service and everybody would raise their hand to receive the member. And then sometimes there was follow-up, but not always. They had a membership class they wanted people to go to. They would schedule baptism, but not the kind of membership intake you're talking about where we would get to know these folks. And then the difference between the number of members that were on the roster and the number of people we saw regularly, of course, about half, something like that, maybe a little more than that.
So just for fun, James, tell everybody when you got there, how many members did you have?
So they're about 1,400 members. They're right on the cusp of 1,400 members, and they were looking forward to crossing that barrier.
Yeah. So now, 10 years later, as we have this conversation, you have how many members now?
So I think it'd be reasonable to say we have about 650, maybe 700 members.
So I assume then that means your budget was cut in half in the last decade?
Oh, by God's grace, it's decreased a little bit, but yeah, not in half at all, maybe 10%, something like that. God's been really gracious to us. But it's much to your point. I mean, regardless of what the number was, we really had 700 or so people functioning as members. And now I think it'd probably be more accurate to say we have around 500 to 550 that are functioning as members. So we still have some work to do. And we want to increase the process for receiving members, not to make it more difficult, to your deacon's point, but to make it more difficult to say, if you want to be a member of this church, this is what it means. And they just had no concept of covenant fidelity in membership.
Well, and I find that real Christians, whether they know it or not, want to be a part of something that matters. And so when it's easier to join the Lions Club than it is the local church, there's a problem. And so what you just articulated, I think, points everything to that this isn't about numbers. It's about health. And church membership is about a group of people who understand what it means to be a member and have a stake in the game, a responsibility to this church. And when that happens, as you've experienced and I have, and why we're advocating for this and talking about this and giving it its own week, is that the church totally changes in its level of impact and enjoyment of each other when you have members who understand what that means.
Church membership is not voluntary association for the sake of a benefit that it may bring to me. That's why you join a social organization. Church membership is a covenant relationship with other believers, committing to their ultimate good and them committing to your ultimate good. That's just very different. But it's much more satisfying spiritually. Yeah. And we're not doing it for self-serving purposes, but it's better for the individual.
And as a pastor who went from a church that really didn't understand membership to, by the time I left, really understood it, it's the joy in pastoring those people is hard to describe.
Yeah, great benefit to you and to them.
That's
yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.